Number one, notice how that's put. This is the list of what we as followers of Christ consider to be the inspired documents that were handed on to us. That's not necessarily to say that there might not be other inspired documents. But what it is to say is these are the ones that we will verify have been received as authentic. So maybe some of the others are authentic too. But a lot of the others show, the things that you read about, all of a sudden there's been a new gospel discovered. And then some other scripture scholars will say, no, new gospel, that's been known for 200 years, and it's a 3rd century Gnostic text. It doesn't even have any claim to coming from the 1st century. All that kind of stuff. But the media just love to play those things up. So at any rate, that was a long way of maybe giving a little bit of background, but what started that was it's an even longer and more involved thing to explain why Matthew came first rather than Mark. But scholars are almost unanimous today that Mark came first. Matthew and Luke are dependent on Mark, but they also are dependent on their own sources, which are different. And apparently there is another source that may or may not have been written down. The scholars call it the Q document, that accounts for things in Matthew and Luke that are the same, but are not found in Mark. John has a few parallels, but John seems to be depending on a completely different way of telling the story of Jesus. What is remarkable, as I said, is here you have 4 different accounts written between 70 A.D. and maybe 100 A.D., coming from all different places in the Roman Empire. And what is remarkable is not the differences. What's remarkable is the similarities. The way that they are truly consistent, even in their many, many variations. So, that having been said, I think what I ended with last week was that little thing in Mark, and this is the only thing in Mark. It's only in Mark. Luke and Matthew choose to omit this. But about the certain young man who was following him wearing nothing but a linen cloth, they caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. Raymond Brown, who says, this passage still is kind of puzzling in its origin as to who that might be and why Mark is the only one saying it. But he says that there is a real interesting symmetry between this event right before the end, the death and the arrest, the passion and death of Jesus, and an event that happened right after the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. And that is the call of the disciples. Remember, the disciples right at the beginning were called, and all of the evangelists, in one way or another, make it very clear that they left everything to follow him. Here, Mark is including one of the disciples. By the way, if you read the Gospel of Mark, you know that Mark does not like Jesus' disciples. Peter in particular. He misses no opportunity to criticize them, to portray them as being dumb, as not getting Jesus' message, and all of that. For whatever reason, if we only had Mark's gospel, if that was the only gospel we had, we'd have to say about the disciples, and especially the 12 apostles, oh dear, what was Jesus thinking? If they were such louts, who actually did take over. But it's pretty clear, for whatever reason, Mark's got his own sort of little reasons for that. The other Gospels, fortunately we have them, they can balance it a lot. But Mark may be just adding one delicious final little irony there. The disciples leave everything to follow Jesus, even insofar as Peter proclaiming, "Lord, I will die with you." And then when Jesus is arrested, this one, kind of representing the disciples in spirit, leaves everything to get away from Jesus. So there's an interesting little symmetry there, a little artistic symmetry. The opposite of what happened at the beginning happens towards the end. Ancient writers were really good at that. They just loved to throw something in here that mirrored something over there, and to see if the people who were reading it or listening to it caught it. And so that may be the sort of thing that happened there with that young man who runs away naked. Now, I think where we actually said we were going to start off today was beginning with the trials. And there were two trials of Jesus. One was a Jewish trial before the high priest. And then when they find him guilty, and we'll see there's a little difference in how they find him guilty in the different Gospels, they lead him off to Pilate, Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor, and then we have the Roman trial. Now, the way that the Gospels, at very least Mark, Matthew, and John portray it, it's interesting that Luke doesn't quite portray it that way. But those three Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and John, portray this trial being at night. Now for John, night is very symbolic, because light is symbolic. So we could certainly expect that for John, obviously the trial of Jesus is something that happens at night, because those who were the Jewish leaders, the temple priests, the high priest, Annas in this instance, and Caiaphas, the high priests were in darkness. Just like when he said at the Last Supper, when Judas went out, his next phrase was, "And it was night." John plays a lot around with light and darkness there. The difficulty that many have had is that it's not very good jurisprudence, and it was actually against the Jewish law to have a trial at night. It was also against the Jewish law to have the sentence passed at the same time as guilt or innocence was tried. Sort of like our law, too, for capital sentencing. You try the person for whether he's guilty or innocent, and then at another time is the trial for the sentencing. Often not a jury trial, but nonetheless, the sentencing happens at a different time.